Blessed is our God, always, now, and ever, to ages of ages. Amen. O heavenly King, the comforter, the Spirit of truth, everywhere present and filling all things, treasurer of blessings and giver of life, come and abide in us and cleanse us from every stain and save our souls, O good one. Holy God, holy mighty, holy immortal, have mercy on us. Holy God, holy mighty, holy immortal, have mercy on us. Holy God, holy mighty, holy immortal, have mercy on us. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, now and ever, to ages of ages. Amen. O heaven, O Holy Trinity, have mercy on us. Lord, cleanse us from our sins. Master, pardon our transgressions. Holy One, visit and heal infirmities for your name's sake. Lord, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. Lord, have mercy. Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, now and ever, to ages of ages. Amen. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. For yours are the kingdom and the power and the glory of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, now and ever, to ages of ages. Amen. One more brief little note. When you have a question, we'll certainly open up to questions and answers at the end of the session. But it's really helpful if you put your question into the chat box, then everyone can see your question and understand it. We'll also repeat it, but then it just makes things more orderly. Thank you. Okay. Nicole, please take over.
Hey, thank you, Father Leonard. Good morning, everybody. How are we doing today? I'm gonna switch over to my slides here. Father, could I? Oh, sorry, it's here. All right. Last night we talked a little bit about trauma, what trauma is, and also sort of the mystery of trauma, the fact that we can never fully comprehend what a trauma is for each person. This morning, we're going to get a little bit more practical, or maybe practical isn't the right word, but we're going to look a little bit at what trauma does to the body and how it's experienced in the body. And this is part of why trauma is such a complicated beast to heal. When we've experienced it's not just an emotional, it's not quote unquote just an emotional challenge. It's something that affects the whole human person, including down into the body and our cells. So we're going to take a look at that. And this session is going to be a bit informational. It's going to be a lot of some science, some biology, some neurology. In the next session, we're going to get a little bit creative and think about how some of this information that we learned this morning pertains to the Orthodox life. I think we're given a lot of tools in Orthodoxy for understanding ourselves as creatures with bodies and creatures, that are incarnational, where our soul is interwoven with our body. So next session, we're gonna take this information and get creative. I'd like to even hear some of your ideas for what sorts of ideas and insights and connections this morning's talk brings for you as you think about Orthodoxy. So I'm calling this the time zones of trauma. That'll make a bit more sense as we get into the meat of the talk. And I'd like to just begin with a quick question. This is my same question that I started with last night, and I do want to start with it again. And that's just kind of a moment to check in with your bodies and ask yourself, how do you feel in your body as we begin today's talk? And if you'd like to share an answer, you can do that on Mentimeter, just scanning the QR code with your phone's camera. It'll take you to the Mentimeter site where I have this question. Again, I use Mentimeter for some of these questions because it allows people to answer anonymously. I do a lot of work with trauma survivors and such, and I like to offer anonymity and confidentiality whenever I'm able to do so, to help people feel more safe in responding. So, how do you feel in your body as we begin this talk? Father Leonard, could I ask you to mute your mic just because I'm getting some, I think I'm getting some background noise from your mic. Is the presentation working for people? Are you able to get into the Mentimeter? There we go. There we go. Sometimes it doesn't always work. More relaxed, focused, sunshine, rested, happy, homesick. Let's think about physical sensations you might be feeling. Tension, tired. There's a particular part of your body that's feeling a certain way, like tense shoulders. Let's really try to think about our bodies and not only our emotional states. So I'll give us a few more moments here. I see some people miss the Mentimeter code. If you, here, I'll put the resources link. The Mentimeter link and code is somewhere on the first or second page of that document that I just linked to. Okay, I see the answers, a few more answers coming in. Shaky, distracted. I'm gonna go back to the slides now. You can still keep thinking about this question. And I invite you to, anytime you're feeling throughout this talk or next session, anytime you're feeling a little bit out of it or something's not quite right, you can return to that question. How am I feeling in my body? What's going on in my body? It's a good way to be able to anchor yourself in the present and just get a better sense of what's going on for you. And a lot of times when we just take a moment to gain awareness of where we are at and how we're feeling, it opens up our bandwidth a little bit to be able to re-enter the present with more capacity and bandwidth. So as I mentioned, the session today is time zones of trauma over time in the mind and body. And I want to start, we can answer this one in the chat. I don't think this is a sensitive question. I want to ask you all, what time is it where you are? And I am asking about a clock time. This is not a trick question where you're supposed to say some mystical answer like the present moment or God's time or anything like that. I just want to know, what time is it according to the clock? So we have 10:49, 8:45, 9:49, 9:50, 9:40. So, we have people from various time zones, probably mostly in North America. I don't think we have anybody outside of North America. But as I suspected, many of us are an hour or two apart. And I always I always find that fascinating when I can be having a conversation with somebody and knowing that they're, in a sense, they're ahead of me in time. They've already experienced more of the calendar date than I have. And yet we're able to have a conversation across time zones. That's something that always fascinates me. Um, I start with that question because as we start to look at the way trauma lives in the body, the way trauma affects the body, it can get really confusing, and it's really hard for a lot of people to understand how it is that our bodies, or even specific zones of our bodies, can be reacting to something that may have happened years ago, even though our conscious mind knows that it's January 28th, 2023. I think that's the date. But in any case, our conscious mind may know the date that it actually is according to the calendar, whereas our body, or parts of our body, parts of our physiology, may be reacting to something that we barely even remember, and reacting to that thing as though it were in the present. And so, because that's a hard thing to grasp and wrap our minds around, particularly if it's not something that you've really experienced yourself, or at least been aware that you've experienced, I have two sort of metaphors that I like to use to introduce this idea. And the first is the idea of time zones and jet lag. If you've ever traveled a long distance by plane, you know that it takes, even after you arrive in the new destination, and you know, your brain knows that you're in a new time zone, it still takes a while for your body to catch up to that time zone. And you can't just tell your body, well, don't be sleepy right now, because technically it's only 6 p.m. in the new time zone. Don't be sleepy. If you tell your body not to be sleepy, it's not going to do anything. You have to kind of wait it out and allow your body naturally to come into the new time zone. And I've done a lot of traveling between North America and Europe, and every time I'm like, I'm not gonna get jet lag. I'm not gonna get jet lag, and then I do. And I like to pay attention to different parts of my body, and it seems to me different parts of my body catch up to the new time zone at different speeds. So my digestive system will takes a little bit longer than my circadian rhythm energies. So even if I kind of recover my sleep and sort of get in the program of when to sleep within 2 or 3 days, it might be more like 4 or 5 days before I start to be hungry at the right meal times in the new time zone. Or even when I normally use the washroom, I might use the washroom at times that are more like in my earlier time zone, having to wake up in the middle of the night in the new time zone to use the washroom, which I normally don't have to do. So all the systems in our body are kind of catching up at slightly different speeds until maybe a week passes and we're finally in the new time zone. All of our cells are in the new time zone, just in time for our vacation to end, and we have to fly back to our old time zone, and the process begins all over again. So that's one metaphor that you can use for understanding how just the fact that we kind of experience having a multitude of time zones and times in us when we experience jet lag. The other metaphor that I point people towards. Oh, and by the way, the reason I have this book on here, The Railway Journey, is it's just a good book. It's a book by a German historian about how time zones even came to be, and different ways that time kind of became standardized and sort of industrialized throughout the 19th century with the rise of modern industrialization. So thought I'd mention that. It's just an interesting book. It has nothing to do with trauma or theology, but it's a good book. All right, back to the time zones of trauma. The other metaphor that I like to use for understanding this tension that tends to happen in trauma between mind and body, conscious awareness and subconscious and and physiological sensations that we hold within us is the fear of heights. So let me see in the chat, or even if you want to raise your hand in the videos, who finds it uncomfortable? Who finds heights uncomfortable? Like standing next to a cliff, going to the top of the CN Tower and standing on the glass floor to look down. Does anyone find that uncomfortable? We've got a few people in chat. So those of you who, Janet's emphatically saying yes. So we've got a lot of people who are saying yes. The people who are saying that they struggle with this. So the people who said this doesn't bother you, this question is not for you. Let's just hear from the people that it does bother. Let's pretend that you can close your eyes for a moment and imagine that you're standing at the Grand Canyon, and you're a little bit away from the railing. They've got all these railings at the Grand Canyon, and you're a few steps away from that, so you can't really like look right over. What happens in your mind's eye as you walk towards that railing and bend over? Imagine doing that. And tell us in the chat, just imagining that in your mind, what happens in your body right now? Stomach butterflies, tight chest, shaky legs. I feel dizzy. My heart is racing. I mean, I'm only able to half do that because I'm having to explain it. So I'm not really fully able to put myself in that imaginative space. But even my heart is like racing. Nausea, queasy, dizzy. Okay, but you guys, we're not even at the Grand Canyon. This is all imagination. So why is your body responding? Well, we know we're responding because it's scary, because maybe we've had experiences where in person we have been in front of a great height and it's scary to look down. Maybe we've had experiences where we've fallen off things, like fallen off a bike, fallen down the stairs. Even falls that are not catastrophic teach us that gravity can be scary. Falling can hurt, and our body does what it needs to do to keep us from falling. So even if we just imagine it, our body starts to respond as though we're really at the Grand Canyon. This is I think this is one of the more helpful metaphors in understanding how trauma can affect us really deeply. So imagine if you're someone who's really afraid of heights, it's understandable that you would have trouble when you're actually standing in front of something. But if it becomes a real psychological struggle, you may find that even things that only indirectly remind you of heights are also very stressful, like things like railings or calendars that have vistas where there's a deep drop in the picture. Like these things may make you feel uncomfortable. In trauma, we may, if we have gone through a particular trauma experience, when we try to remember that experience, or when a memory of that experience intrusively pops up into our mind without us welcoming it, our bodies may start to respond in all the ways that it responded to in that actual moment to keep us safe. But and I think that makes sense to us. But that process can also happen even with things that only indirectly remind us of that experience. The color of a person's shirt, specific scents, specific tones of voice or facial expressions or micro expressions, things where we're going about our life and we wouldn't recognize these tiny little cues as being in any way related to the trauma experience that we had. But our nervous systems and our bodies are picking up on them. And maybe on a very subtle level, start to respond, start to do the things that they need to do to keep us safe or keep us away from that cue or from that threat. And we may not even be aware that this is happening. We may only feel, oh, we feel a little stressed out. We feel a little anxious. We feel a little tired suddenly. We feel really annoyed, like we need to just walk out of the room and we don't know why. And people who are kind of struggling with this, maybe even they know, oh, this is a trigger for me. This reminds me of that. Maybe they know consciously. They can't just tell themselves, yeah, but that's in the past. That's not what's happening. So don't respond that way. They can't just tell themselves that any more than people who are afraid of heights can't just tell themselves, well, I'm not at the Grand Canyon. I'm only imagining it. I'm not in any danger, because your bodies are going to respond. So maybe try and hold one of these metaphors in your mind, whichever one like resonates more with you, as we go through this information this morning. There are two dominant approaches when we talk about trauma healing. All different kinds of professionals do work around trauma and trauma healing: psychiatrists, psychologists, therapists, physicians. I work as a coach around trauma recovery. And so all of us have slightly different approaches that we take, modalities, strategies, etc., when working with people around trauma. But most of these modalities and approaches fall into sort of two dominant categories. The first is what I call a mind down or brain down approach. And that's indicated by, not rocket science here, but just it's indicated by this arrow that starts at the brain and goes down to the body. And the second approach is indicated by the second arrow, which starts from the body and goes up to the mind. And that is known as a body up approach or a body forward approach. The rationale behind these approaches, they're both aimed at the same thing, which is to help resolve the symptoms and distress of trauma experiences for the client or the patient. And the first approach, the mind down approach, seeks to do this by beginning with what the person is consciously aware of and cognitively able to express. So think of traditional talk therapy, where you might work with somebody about the memories you have from childhood or the memories you might have of a trauma experience, or and by a trauma experience, I don't mean just one single event. You could have a trauma experience of your whole childhood, your whole family dynamic, in the case of things like complex trauma, where it's not just one single experience that traumatized you, but a set of dynamics in the environment that together created a complex trauma. So a mind down approach might be something like traditional talk therapy. You're talking about your memories. You're talking about feelings that come up. You're talking through them. It's you start with your thoughts. You start with what you're aware of. And it's sort of thought that the more you talk through these, the more you piece together parts of your story in a way that forms meaning and kind of gives you control over in the way you tell your story, that gradually that will have an effect on your overall well-being. And this mind down approach, by the way, it's not about which one is better or worse or bad or good or anything like that. There are merits to both approaches. The mind down approach has sort of been the dominant way that we think about not just trauma, but mental health in general. We live in a very brain mind centered culture, Western culture, that prioritizes things of the mind over states of the body. And so, for decades and decades, that has been the dominant way that we approach things like trauma, mental health disorders, and other sort of cognitive struggles that we may have. I see your question, Peter, and I'll get to that. The other approach is the body up. And that's where we start um, we start with where the body is at and how the body is processing things like memories, um, present stressors, and we tune into the body and we learn to build tolerance and understanding of the physiological imprint of trauma. And we're gonna explore what that even is, what I mean when I say the physiological imprint of trauma. But the question that I began with, and that I begin most of my talks with, how are you feeling in your body? That's an example of a body up approach to giving a talk is starting from the body and reminding ourselves that our bodies are a part of how we're experiencing things too. We tend to forget about our bodies, and yet we our bodies have a lot to teach us. And so this is actually the newer wave of trauma, of how we work with trauma. We're learning how much the body has to show us about trauma and how important it is to sort of begin with the body. A lot of times with my clients, for example, I actually, sometimes I'll have clients come in where they want to talk about everything right away. And I have to slow them down and I have to actually encourage them to wait, because even though we may feel this burden to want to share and share with somebody, we may not be in a place where we can actually talk about things in a safe way. Our bodies, so kind of like just imagining standing by the Grand Canyon can bring up like that stressy feeling in your body. Talking about the most painful things that have ever happened to us also have an effect on our body. And it's not actually the best idea to start there. Instead, I try to work with clients to make them, first of all, more aware of their body, more aware of when their body is saying, no, 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 stop. I don't feel safe right now. I don't want to talk about this. Being able to regulate stress responses in the body so that when eventually they choose to talk about these painful events and experiences, they can hear what their body is saying and they can stop when their body is saying, we've shared all we want to share today, or this is making me uncomfortable, or there's real pain here and I need to stop and process what I'm thinking about. And that sounds very basic, but it's actually something that takes a lot of time. Sometimes when I start working with the clients, one of the things that is not uncommon for trauma survivors, and it's kind of a basic test that I'll do with a client. I'll ask them to try and feel their heartbeat, whether it's on their neck, whether it's kind of just plugging your ears and you can kind of feel the pulse against your ears. You can feel your heartbeat inside. Not uncommon for trauma survivors to not be able to do that. So even when they're putting their fingers in the right place to gauge their pulse or putting their hands on their heart, their interoception, that's a term for being able to be aware of inner physiological sensations and processes, their interoception has so been eroded by the habit of disconnecting and dissociating in subtle ways from their body that they can't even feel their heart beating. And so we have to work on learning to be comfortable in the body before we can get to talking about the tough stuff. And the interesting thing about that is sometimes that's all a client needs. They come in with all of these really hugely distressing, painful events that have happened to them. And they think that what they need to do is talk about it all and get it all off their chest and have somebody listen. And then we get through some of the body work and there's nothing to talk about. This doesn't always happen, but it is amazing how often that's the case, that now that they're able to be present with themselves in their body, with their pain, with their stress, they're able to tolerate it and know that it's not going to hurt them. Suddenly, the big bad wolf in the closet, the trauma experience that they've been keeping bottled up for so long, suddenly doesn't feel as distressing and unbearable as it used to. So this is sort of an overview of these two approaches. Now, Peter in the chat asked if you can do both at the same time. And yes, like in my coaching, I do a combined approach. I usually call my approach a body forward, meaning I sort of start with body work, and I continue to incorporate that throughout the coach's throughout the client's time with me. But I don't say we're never going to talk about things, or we're never going to examine thoughts or anything like that. We definitely do that, but I personally, the way I practice is I start with the body, and I try to help clients slow down from all the mind stuff until they can build up regulation and tolerance in their bodies. Natalie asked, I think with regard to the situation I mentioned, where clients often don't feel a heartbeat, or they feel they're so disconnected from their bodies that they can't feel or be aware of very basic things happening in their body. She asks, how long does it take to know your body feelings? It takes as long as it takes. For some people, it'll be, I have some exercises and I'm going to give you guys one of them. For some people, it's a week of, it's once they have some things explained to them, it's like eyes are open and suddenly they're seeing life through a whole new lens. And after about a week, they've made a lot of progress. For some people, it's more than that, where they can start to be aware of things like their heartbeat and other basic stress responses. For most people, you have kind of an awareness of these things. You all might feel a bit of a new awareness after we get through this talk. And then it's kind of a learning process to put that together with how you experience life and to kind of grow into that new awareness. Living body forward is a very different way of living than how most of us in our culture live. And I think some of us, probably most of us, already have a sense of that, because I think in the Orthodox Church is a very, in many ways, it's a body forward faith. It's a faith that has so many different sensory elements, icons, incense, music for the ears, the Eucharist, taste, and smell. And all different, we're constantly involving all of the senses. We might have frustrations incorporated into our daily prayers. We, even before this session began, when Father said the Trisagion prayer, we cross ourselves. We bring our bodies into what we do spiritually, because we have this awareness that we're not just brains, we're not just intellects, we are psychosomatic creatures. So I think this sort of body forward way of living and approaching things like pain and woundedness is not antithetical, probably feel familiar to many of us. But that doesn't mean, we still live in our dominant Western culture. And many of us, most of my clients are Orthodox, and many of them very faithfully so. And yet all of us still need a lot. We have to work intentionally to actually be in our bodies most of the time. So this is an overview. I just wanted to mention that to give you some context. All right, this is a quote. You have access to my slides. I'm gonna probably skip some of these, but some of these quotes, Bessel van der Kolk, his book, The Body Keeps the Score, it's like the Bible of, I think it's at least 10 years old now, but yeah, it's quite thick. It's like the book about kind of understanding the basics of how trauma affects and lives in the body. And it's kind of the go-to resource. It's a bit dense, it's hard to get through. There's neurological diagrams all over the place and such, but it's an amazing resource. And he writes that being traumatized means continuing to organize your life as if the trauma were still going on, unchanged and immutable, as every new encounter or event is contaminated by the past. This is something that again, it's hard to wrap your mind around. If you think of, I think a lot of us have these sort of extreme caricatured Hollywood pictures of what it means to be traumatized. We think of the soldier in the middle of the night who's having flashbacks and kicking and screaming and yelling in his bed, and believes he's still on the battlefield. That is a real thing. That is a real thing. So I don't want to, and some people in this group may have experienced that. That is a real thing. Incredibly painful and distressing. But that's probably, if we think of trauma as kind of a spectrum, that's probably the sort of extreme end. It's visible. It's a very like rigid flashback in that the person may not in any way be aware of what's actually going on in the present. But this tendency to live in the present as though it's tainted by the past experience is something that can be very, very subtle, that we ourselves may not always realize when we're having one of these subtle flashbacks. So I used an example, I shared an example of an experience I had in 5th grade with my 5th grade teacher, Mr. W, and some unkind words he said to me. And those words continued to shape me in ways where, you know, I wouldn't have been consciously aware of. It took time to become consciously aware of. But maybe I was going through my day and a situation arose where I needed to stand up for myself, or I needed to tell somebody that's not okay with me. And in my mind, I don't associate that with what it means to be a good girl. A good girl is compliant and goes and does what people want her to do. And I don't want people to think I'm a bad girl. So I'm gonna stifle that need to stand up for myself or say no, so that others will think I'm a good girl. I would have thoughts like that, and not thoughts where you can hear every single word audibly in your head in this rational, logical way, but it's almost more of a feeling thought that that I would have all the time in situations. And it was only by doing a lot of work I started wondering, what's this good girl thing about? Why am I so upset about needing to be the good girl? And then thinking through, when have people told me I'm not a good girl? When have people used that kind of language with me? Oh, remembering this thing with Mr. W. So we kind of live with these layers or lenses, and we're not even always aware that they are tainting our present moment. I kind of wanted to to point out some important, like, if we were to take one trauma experience and make kind of a timeline of what the important points in time are pertaining to that experience. I wanted to kind of act as sort of a tour guide of what actually goes into a trauma experience on a temporal level. So, and I am going to just continue to use this Mr. W example just because I brought it up yesterday and I need some kind of example to go back to. And if you weren't here yesterday, just to summarize, my 5th grade teacher said some things to me along the lines of He didn't know if I was a good girl or a bad girl because every time he thought I was a good girl, I messed up and acted like a bad girl. So he doesn't know what to think of me. And it was a very painful um, thing for me. That, along with a lot of other experiences I've had in my life, sort of shaped my ability to feel to be in touch with my internal sense of goodness and relate to the world around me in a safe and confident way. Okay, so if you think of a trauma experience, and I have an asterisk by a traumatic experience, because again, as I mentioned before, we're not necessarily talking about a single event, like uh, um, a rape or something. Although that may be, a person may go through their life without any real distressing experiences. They may grow up in a perfectly stable, secure, attached home environment, and then they experience something like a rape, and that single trauma experience can suddenly thrust them into the world of a trauma survivor. That happens. But for many people that I work with, it's usually a bit more complicated than that. It's usually not a single event, but a whole dynamic in their growing up years or in the context of a marriage or some other relational environment like a workplace where there's sort of one micro trauma after another, to the point where they can't even necessarily pick out, oh yeah, that experience and that experience, those were the traumas. It's this whole cesspool of a dynamic. Also probably mixed in with some good aspects of that relational dynamic. So it gets really complicated. And that's what we mean when we're talking about complex trauma. So anyway, let's think of the trauma experience, whether it's a single event or set of events or entire dynamic and environment, as the during. That's this middle point in the timeline. Okay. But what makes an experience a trauma, what makes an event a trauma experience, is not just what happens in that during, but also what comes before that. And here I'm talking about particularly our childhood years, but also everything that may have come before that trauma experience. So previous experiences of safety and connection we have had, if we've had not enough experiences of safety or connection, or the connections we've had in life have been unstable, this will make us more prone to experience events as traumas. Our level of attachment to caregivers and loved ones, if you know anything about attachment theory, it's definitely not something I would consider myself an expert in, but suffice it to say, the way we are attached to others and the way our caregivers show attachment to us is really important for our formation and development. Level of stability in our lives are things, particularly in our growing up years, are things pretty stable from day to day? Or do we spend our childhood wondering what tomorrow is going to bring, or wondering if there's going to be food on the table, or wondering if daddy's going to be in a good mood or a bad mood, or if he's going to be drunk or sober, et cetera, et cetera. Are we going to be moving again? This or that. Level of stability in our lives. If we were exposed to greater levels of instability and uncertainty, that may set us up to be more prone to experience things as trauma. Adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, kind of one of the big areas of research right now. You can look into that. There's a whole list of what constitutes an adverse childhood experience. It can be things like divorce, having a parent who's an addict, things like that, experiencing physical abuse. And you can actually come up with a score by checking off. There's online evaluations you can find by checking off how many of these experiences you were exposed to as a child. And it will give you an ACEs score. And that has been shown, and we're learning more and more about this, that has been shown to make us more susceptible to a whole host of things like addiction, incarceration rates, etc. But one of the things that makes us susceptible to is experiencing events as traumas, where someone with a lower ACE score may experience the same thing and not experience it as necessarily a capital T trauma experience in your life. Whereas if we have a higher ACE score, we may go through something, and because we don't have the internal resources to cope with it, um, mentally or physiologically to cope with the stress of it, then we may relate to that experience as a trauma. And then how all of these factors from our childhood on, how all of them come together to affect our overall physiology. I guess I put physiological twice, probably because I feel very strongly about our physiology, but how all of these factors come together to affect us physiologically, neurologically, and developmentally. Again, I think this is something we sort of intuitively understand in the Orthodox faith. We know that we are wondrously and fearfully made by God. And we know that the human condition is complex and that our sin affects others. Our sin is not just our own, it's a web that affects all of those around us. And we know that we pass down tendencies and traits. We pass down things like, when we think of generational sin, we maybe don't pass down the blame and guilt associated with sin, but we pass down sort of patterns of being that are spiritually sick. I'm not saying trauma is a sin, but certainly the kinds of acts and behaviors that bring about trauma are often sins and acts of evil. And they affect people, not just in their minds, but they affect their whole internal capacity and way of being. Father Leonard reminds us that Forgiveness Sunday is coming up. That's a hopeful thing to keep in mind, because some of this gets pretty dark when you start thinking about all the things that we do to each other and things that people have done to us. Okay, so here's the trauma event. We've talked about the before leading up to the trauma event. Now we're going to talk about what happens after. And the way I sort of picture this is almost like if you drop a rock into the lake and there's ripples that come out from that rock. These ripples extend backwards and forwards in time for us. So how we are raised, what our physiological makeup and development are like, will affect how we interpret an event. And one of the examples that I use, real life example, I have two friends, one of whom was hit by a drunk driver. He was in his car, hit by a drunk driver. Car was totaled. He spent months. It was unclear whether he was going to survive. Eventually, he spent months in the hospital rehabilitating. He made it through that without a lot of trauma. He doesn't necessarily experience that point in his life. He doesn't describe that point in his life as a time of trauma. I have another friend who, she wasn't in an accident, but she almost hit somebody. She almost hit somebody with her car, a child. She didn't. The child was fine. She didn't actually hit the child. But that experience, experience of almost hitting the child, and in that moment, knowing that she might have been responsible for ending somebody's life, really threw her for a loop and really opened up things for her that she had to deal with, and PTSD like symptoms, entering things like school zones, or coming up to stop signs and having to double, triple, quadruple check in her mind if she was she actually putting on the brakes? Was she putting on the brakes fast enough? Could she trust herself that she was actually putting on the brakes? Could she trust her eyes that there were no children walking in front of her car? So these are two examples where we would assume the person who was in the drunk driving accident, he can't even remember the accident because his brain, it was this huge thing in his brain, like his memories of the actual accident are not there anymore, or at least not that he can remember. we would assume that that is like, quote unquote, the more traumatic experience because it's a bigger deal. He had to do more physical healing, et cetera, et cetera. Whereas this woman who didn't even hit anybody, everyone's fine, we would assume that's the less traumatic experience. But there's something about her makeup, her view of herself, her view of the world, her view of, fragility and uncertainty, her tendency to blame herself, like place a deeper blame on herself for things that may or may not even be in her control. All of that sort of coalesces in this experience of almost hitting the child and turns that experience into what we would qualify as a trauma that she has had to do actual work around to recover from. So that's before, leading up to the actual event, and then after the event happens, the hours and days following a traumatic experience are times when what we need most of all are, I think of it as the 3 S's: safety, slowness, and shelter. So safety from certainly from any physical harm. If someone's on the side of, gets hit by a car and is on the side of the road, you obviously want to make sure they are safe from more cars hitting them. So you pull them off the road because they're not able to protect themselves. But that's kind of a metaphor for what we would do for someone who's suffering from a more emotional trauma, like emotional abuse, or you know, a, someone like being trolled online, in abuse online. You want to get them safe from any psychological or physical harm so that their body and mind can start to take over and do the things that are necessary to enact the healing process. You want to slow things down. So, a lot of times we might ask people, how are you doing? How are you doing with all of this? How are you feeling? What do you need? What can I do? If a person has gone through an experience that was really rupturing for them, we maybe don't want to ask so many questions because that's just forcing their brain to work harder to answer and to be in conversation. Instead, we can speak slower, we can talk more softly, we can try to come up with answers to questions on our own. Instead of asking, what do you need? Just imagine what they might need and go and get it for them and have it on hand, whether it's food or water or something warm, or just a place to be, and just sitting with people. And finally, shelter. And I don't just mean a physical shelter, but anything that you can do to put in the person's physical environment to signal safety and connection. Warm blankets, tea, fruit, like anything that we can do to surround them with safety so that they don't have to think, and they don't have to keep trying to keep themselves safe. And all of this in the degree to which that is actually appropriate for what they've experienced. So if somebody stubs their toe and they're really upset about it and you're concerned that it might become a trauma experience, you don't need to sit them down and cover them with a shock blanket and start talking in soothing tones. But that's a funny example, but you know what I mean? Like you apply all of this creatively to the degree that it seems like it would be useful for the type of experience the person has just gone through. I've had people sort of contact me and kind of consult with me. They've maybe had a friend who just watched her husband die very suddenly, or a child die or something like that. And they will contact me and be like, what do I do so that because I think she's just gone through something traumatic. Well, it's like, that was 3 days ago. You have no way of knowing whether that person will internalize that event as a trauma, but you can, so don't pull out the T word before it's time. You don't have to all of a sudden right away brand this was a major trauma. Let the dust settle, give them safety, give them shelter, give them slowness, and let them move through that event at the speed that they're able to process and let them figure out what it's going to mean for them. The first 3 months following an experience that could potentially be traumatic are really critical. So after the sort of immediate physical or psychological danger has settled, this is the time when the mind begins consolidating memories, forming meaning of the event, deciding what sort of story, what sort of script the mind is going to tell about that event, and figuring out where it's going to store memories and how it's going to store memories. Um, and this is a time when it's really common for a person to, you see this a lot after someone dies, and it's really healthy. At a funeral or at a wake or whatever, the loved ones will be talking about the person. I just saw them yesterday. The last conversation I had with them, I just keep remembering how they said this or that, and they kind of are maybe retelling the story of those last few days of the person's life over and over and over, or sharing the same memories of that person over and over. And the reason they're doing that, I mean, aside from the fact that they're maybe all different people and they want to just make people aware, they want to make sure all the people hear the same story. Part of why they're doing that kind of repetitive storytelling is their brains are trying to synthesize the past with the present. Their brains are trying to say, to figure out how it's going to tell this story, and then based on that, where and how it's going to store the memories that pertain to these stories. And it's really important to just let people do that, even though sometimes it's repetitive. And you might think, again, from our brain, we live in our brains. I've already heard this story before. I've already heard this story 35 times. And like, we might think maybe they keep telling us this because they don't realize I'm actually listening, but I am. That's not why they're telling. They're telling it for them, for their brains. Their brains are doing something that's very natural and beautiful and important. When people can't do this, when they can't tell their stories in safe environments and stuff, and have their stories witnessed by others, their brains will start to fragment their memories and store them in compartments rather than as one stream of retrievable memories. There's an infographic in your resources list about how trauma experiences can affect 4 different categories of memories and the different parts of the brains that are affected. So if you're curious about this, you can look at that infographic. Yeah, Betty brings up, special days like birthdays, Christmas, Easter. These are times, places in time where similar to right after a person's death, loved ones on anniversaries and birthdays and stuff may have sort of a similar need to be telling these stories. And, in the Orthodox Church, we have memorials. We have times when we get to remember, if we're not doing the healing work on our own, we get this opportunity to do it sort of automatically, to just return to the memory of that person, even briefly during the times of that prayer. But we don't have that for, we have that with the death of a person, but we don't have that for a lot of other griefs and traumas, like the loss of a marriage, the loss of a particular way of life, like after retirement or after job loss, and just more nebulous and hard to categorize traumas, the loss of innocence, the loss of sense of safety with a person. We don't have, obviously, memorials for those types of things because they're not people, they're not souls that were lost necessarily, but we can use the kind of icon and structure of memorials to remind ourselves that maybe sometimes we need to remember other losses and traumas in our life. We maybe need to bring people around us at different intervals as just a time to remember, and so that we don't have to do some of that remembering alone. Natalie, I see your question about the child who's abused. We'll save that until either the end of this session, or if there's not a lot of time for Q&A, we'll definitely have a lot of time in the next session for questions and discussion. Okay, so in the first 3 months, the mind is doing a lot of the sort of consolidating of memories, forming meaning. And actually the school that I did my coaching training based in Canada, and they train a lot of coaches to work with the Canadian military. And I chose not to go into that and get like the extra certification to work for the government and like coach vets coming back from war situations. But a lot of the instructors were involved in that work. And one of the things that they mentioned is like in their work and sort of in the eyes of the Canadian government, the Canadian military, sort of this 3 months is kind of like a golden rule. If they know a soldier has a particularly traumatic experience, they really try to get that soldier into a program of care, if not immediately, then within the first 3 months following that event. And it's because that's such a critical period for when the brain is recovering and forming memories, and like all the neural pathways are developing around that event. So once they're kind of a sort of shape of those memories is established within the brain, from that point on, a lot of it is just confirmation and disconfirmation of that story or the meaning the person has come up with for that event through subsequent life experiences. If you continue through life and you experience things that sort of confirm the sense that, let's say, that men can't be trusted, or if I'm left alone in a room with a man, something bad will happen, or Mr. W thought I was a bad girl and that I wasn't worth a compliment, and other people seem to be chronically disappointed in me, so he must have been right. Or I'm experiencing shame in a present relationship. It must be because I'm not trying hard enough to be good. I'm not good enough. So we kind of continue to confirm or disconfirm throughout our lives. And it can go the opposite way too. If we are able and blessed to enter into relationships that are safe and stable and understanding, that can have an immensely healing effect on things that we've experienced in the past, whether it's intentional or not. Sometimes you find yourself in the right relationship with somebody who, for whatever reason, just gets it and is able to see your pain and the experience that you've gone through, and bear witness to it in a way that makes you feel seen and heard and validated. That can begin to disconfirm the traumatic meaning that you may have formed around a particular event or experience in your life. Another critical point in the timeline of traumatic events is disclosing previous traumatic events. So let's say you went through an experience and you didn't have these first 2 bullet points of people around you to keep you safe, people around you to safely tell your story to. So you kept it all inside. And maybe you didn't even realize how big of a deal it was until long down the road, and you start to realize, oh, that wasn't normal. That wasn't healthy. What my uncle did to me was not legal. And you start to have these memories and realize, wow, I need to tell somebody. And so maybe you disclose to a loved one, to a priest, to a random person. Hopefully it's somebody you know and can trust. That is an extremely critical moment. And this is something to be aware of, both as for those of us, if we do need to ever disclose something that happened to us, but also for us, if we're ever in a situation where someone discloses something to us. Our reaction to what's being disclosed has the power to cause even greater trauma to the person than the actual trauma they're disclosing. So if someone tells me something that is deeply painful that they've never told somebody before, an instance of abuse, or torture or something like that, and I respond with a look of disgust or by minimizing, well, a lot of people go through that though. It's not that big of a deal. Or ignoring, almost like they didn't say anything at all, changing the subject. That response, it's possible. And this, I mean, this is borne out in research, but that response could have do even more damage to that person than the actual trauma. So one thing that I try to practice in my life, not just in my professional work, is I just, as much as possible, I just don't get shocked by things anymore. I just go into life knowing everybody is carrying something, at least one thing that's concealed. And we've probably all got stuff that if we were to share, and I'm not suggesting we do share, but if we were, would probably really shock one another. Things that have happened to us, things we've seen, things we've done that we're not happy about. And so it's just, life's just not worth getting shocked about anymore. Um, so going into things where I'm not shocked and knowing that it's not, I don't need to fix the pain, I don't need to solve the problem, but I can just bear witness. And I have a few phrases that I just try to always have top of mind. How do you feel now that you've told me this? Tell me more. I'm so glad you felt safe enough to tell me. What else would you like me to know about this situation? What do you need to feel safe and connected to me right now? I just try to have some of those phrases always there. So if someone says something to me and internally I do feel shocked and I'm like really thrown for a loop by what they're telling me, I have those kind of, they're not stock phrases because I mean them, but they're almost lines that I can give to help establish a place of safety for the person so that I don't do more damage as they're disclosing to me. So again, some of those are, how do you feel in your body as you're telling me this? Tell me more. I'm grateful, blessed, honored that you feel safe enough to tell me about this. What do you need right now to feel safe and connected to me? And never promising confidentiality. So if someone tells me something, someone says something like, I really need to tell you something, but I need you to not tell anybody. I never say yes to that because I don't know what they're about to tell me, and I don't know what my internal values / legal ethics will require me to share with others. So I don't say no, I can't promise that. I will just gently tell them, let's what I can promise is I will listen to what you have to say non-judgmentally, and we can work together to do whatever needs to be done. Something like that. I don't like promising to confidentiality. And then finally, really taking a lot of time here. The timeline of a trauma experience, even long down the line, small trigger experiences, things that remind us of distressing memories, can keep putting us back into the mindset of the during the experience mentality. And then all of the sort of taking all this big picture stuff together, the long-term stress of having adverse child experiences that make us more susceptible to trauma, of experiencing trauma and of holding that experience within us, and all of the stress responses and ways that our bodies adapt to that experience, all of that has a long-term effect on basically all the systems of our body, not just our mind. They definitely have an impact on our mind. I think that's common sense. they also have an impact on our body, even down to the level of our cells. And that's one area that we're only beginning to learn about. So we don't know a lot about that, but there's enough evidence to suggest that even on the level of our cells and our epigenetics, trauma has an effect. I'm going to skip this. This is just a list of some of the physiological systems that trauma experiences can affect. I mean, basically everything. I do think that the way it affects the storage of memory is really interesting. And I want to mention again the infographic that I put on the resources list. Okay, so what we're going to do now is zoom in on just one part of the body, one major system, one major thing that trauma affects, known as the vagus nerve or the polyvagal nerves, bundle of nerves. But I want to take a really quick break, first of all, because I need to drink some water and make just get a coffee quick from the kitchen. And I also think we just maybe need a moment to process. So let's take 2 or 3 minutes here. It's right now 11:50 my time. The session goes to 12:30. So let's come back like 11:53, 11:54, so we can really get started by 11:55 Eastern and 55 Central. So I'll see you in a few moments.
Thanks, Nicole. Good idea. That's a very dense segment of information. So rich. Thank you.
Restarted in about a minute. But interested for those of you who are still hanging around the chat, how are you all doing with the level of information so far? How are you feeling about it? What's standing out in your mind? You can answer in the chat box if you want. All right, folks, if you're if you've taken a little bit of a break, maybe start to come back here, get comfy again. If you need to stretch out the body, that's a good idea. Get some oxygen flowing to the brain. I recently gave a talk in Wisconsin at an OCF retreat for college students. And one of my sessions was right after lunch. And 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 I was talking about despondency and how despondency, like one of the things that the fathers talk about with despondency is sluggishness and falling asleep out of boredom. And literally, as I was talking, like 4 students in the audience were nodding off and falling asleep. And so I made everybody get up and run around in circles in the room and then sit back down. And they were all much more attentive after that. All right. And feel free, if you ever need to do that, feel free to, we're all on Zoom, we're all at home. If you need to like walk around or something, you do you. I'm standing here and I need to fidget, so. We are gonna turn towards the big P word, polyvagal theory and trauma. And I may not get through this in the time allotted, which means that we most likely won't have a lot of time for questions at the end of this session, but we will have a lot of time in the next session. And if you're for some reason not going to be here for the next session, but you have some questions, maybe make sure to put the questions in the chat, but maybe also just mention that you're not going to be here in the next session. And that way I can make sure to sort of save some of those for the next session, since the chat doesn't carry over. All right, so polyvagal theory and trauma. To start out, I want you to, don't answer yet in the Mentimeter. I want you to close your eyes. Close your eyes and just imagine in your mind a place, a real place that you've actually been in, not an imaginary place. Imagine a place in which you typically feel safe, secure, hopeful, or connected. And by connected, I mean connected to others, the world around you in a meaningful way, to yourself, to God. You don't have to feel all of these things, but a place where in general you feel safe, secure, kind of hopeful, and connected. Once you've thought of that place, spend a few moments just imagining that you're there right now. Now, pause, keep your eyes closed, and check in with your body. How do you feel in your body right now? And try and be as specific as possible. So, is there anywhere in your body that feels light or heavy, warm or cold, tense or relaxed, achy, warm, numb? How would you describe how you feel in your body? Sort of capture that awareness and that description. And let's head over to Mentimeter. And let's see how people are feeling in their body, or how you felt in your body when you were imagining yourself in that safe place. I see, Georgina, it seems like you're trying to answer and it's just making squiggles. I wonder if you don't have it set on text. Warm. Good job. I wonder if something's wrong with the presentation. Maybe it's set to. Oh, Georgina, you know what? Something's on your Zoom. You're drawing on Zoom, not on Mentimeter. Relaxed. What are some other things you become aware of in your body when you imagine yourself in that safe place? Thanks, Peter, for posting the Mentimeter link. Cool head. How does it feel to breathe when you're imagining yourself in that safe place? Is it do you feel like your breaths are full or shallow or tense, comfortable, peaceful, safe? Oh, I'm so sorry. If people are having trouble with a Mentimeter and you wanna answer in chat, feel free to do that. Don't feel like it absolutely has to be Mentimeter. Someone in the chat says my body is calm, feels open, my breathing is slow and deep. I can smell spring air and feel sunshine. Warm and glad, holding a cup of coffee and smiling. Rejuvenating breaths, invigorated. Okay, I'm going to give it a few more moments and then we're going to shift to a different question. Warm, relaxed. Okay. Stomach calm, not shaky or nervous. All the senses go straight into the spine and heart. Ooh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Relaxed. Spring in my step, inhaling. Okay, thank you all for sharing and for really, trying to be specific there. That's so important. And it's so neat to see the different ways that people's bodies respond to safety, even imagined safety. Father Leonard, I don't know if it's possible to erase the drawings on the Zoom. It's at least showing up for me. I don't know if it's showing up for everybody. It's a little distracting. We're gonna shift now to a different question. And go at your own risk. Don't go too dark here. But now I want us to again close our eyes. Try to forget the safe place for a few moments at least. And think of a place that makes you feel a little uncomfortable. Again, a real place that you've actually been to. So think of a place that makes you feel a little uncomfortable, feel at ease, disconnected and isolated, or just dark. And imagine that you're in that place right now. How does it feel in your body to be in that place? And maybe even what's the part of your body that you become most aware of? What's the part of your body that's kind of screaming out for a little bit of attention? And when you feel able, you can let us know either in Mentimeter or chat if you're having trouble with Mentimeter. I am looking at both. Angry, tight chest. Yeah, for me, the first thing was my chest. A lot of people also feel it first in their shoulders. Tunnel vision, blank mind. Watchful in my physical state. Yeah, a little bit of vigilance. And by the way, if any of you are feeling like this is pretty distressing, maybe turn the sound off and just go back to that first place that you were imagining. I don't want to cause anyone too much distress. And I know that sometimes even seemingly harmless memories can bring up really intense feelings sometimes. Tense neck, throat, jittery, upset stomach. How about breathing? What does breathing feel like when you imagine this place? Georgina says holding, she feels like she's holding her breath, like waiting for the hammer to, the shoe to fall, whatever the idiom is. Vulnerable, helpless in general, great physical pain, shallow breaths. Tense, uneasy, want to retreat to a safe place. Yeah. So I don't want to spend too long, you know, in the dark place. So let's all kind of allow ourselves to exit the uncomfortable place and return a little bit again to that first safe place. We're not gonna ask any more questions about either place, but I just want us to give ourselves a moment to step away from any feelings we may have about this second place. The reason I started with these questions is I wanted you to be able to experience on a bit of a subtle level different stress states in your body. And I ask about places because I think it's a little bit less risky in a setting like this than if I were to ask about events. Think about an event that's made you happy, and now think of an event that made you feel disconnected and in danger or something. That could really bring up some trauma stuff for people. And I don't, it's sort of negligent to do that in a mixed setting where I can't really just have a one-on-one conversation with people to guide them through that. So I hope that just thinking about places is maybe a way to just subtly experience some of those stress states. And, it was interesting for me to see some of your responses because so much of it aligns with what we know about the polyvagal nerves branch of nerves. And I'm going to hopefully introduce you to that today. Yesterday, I shared a working definition of trauma as defining it as any event or series of events that a person experiences as too much, too fast, too soon, or too little to process. And the question that I want to raise is when we are saying like to process, what are we talking about? What too much for what to process? We're not simply talking about the intellectual, rational, cognitive brain. We're actually talking about our nervous system. But before I talk about the nervous system and the different branches of the nervous system, we have to understand, what does the nervous system really want? Because we're gonna see some different branches of the nervous system, and it's gonna be like they're almost playing tug of war with each other, trying to create equilibrium in the body. And you start to wonder, what is it even trying, what is it trying to get at? What is the aim of the nervous system? The short answer from a trauma perspective is the nervous system is always trying to move towards safety and connection. It's trying to move us as human creatures towards safety and connection, or in other words, away from harm and disconnection. What are safety and connection? Safety, don't think of safety simply as physical safety. Like, well, a tiger's not running after me, and I'm not being mugged by someone on the street. So why do I feel unsafe? Because that's not what safety is. safety, the way I think of it, is it kind of consists of three pieces. First of all, and most elementally, it's protection from harm. And by harm, I mean physical harm or emotional harm. Or in other words, like external harm or danger in the form of physical danger, or internal in the form of, one moment. I need to pause because my landlord just showed up. I'll be right back. Hi. Okay, sorry about that. So basically, safety is a protection from an external harm. It's also a connection to others in the world. So if you think about back in the day when humans were in hunter-gatherer societies, a lot of their safety came from connection to one another. And so we have safety by being with the pack. And when we are away from our pack, we feel that we are not as safe because it's harder to keep ourselves individually safe. And so connection is a huge part of safety. But not just connection to one another or to other people, but also just a sense of connection to the places around us, the world around us, sources of nourishment, physical, spiritual, emotional, and obviously connection to God. So the third aspect of safety, I apologize, but I was giving the webinar. It's okay. The third aspect of safety from a trauma-informed perspective is freedom or autonomy to choose how we participate in both protection and connection. So imagine that someone, you have a spouse that technically you feel connected with, or so I guess you have someone in your life that theoretically you should feel connected to, but they're demanding in the way that they obtain connection with you. So they're demanding your connection. They're demanding your participation in the relationship. That's not a safe connection. A safe connection is where you get to choose how you're present in the way you connect with others, how you're present in the protection that you obtain. And all of these three pieces of safety are integral to our ability to feel safe and connected. And this is really what the nervous system is trying to seek out for us. So let's talk about the nervous system. The nervous system is made up of two big branches, the central nervous system, and that's in the middle of our body, the brain and the spinal cord. And then we have what's called the peripheral nervous system. And these are the nerves that go out from the central nervous system all over our body. Of the peripheral nerves, there are two sort of branches. The first is the somatic branch. And these are all interwoven with each other throughout the body. But there's the somatic part of the nervous system, and that's conscious and voluntary. So when I touch a hot stove, I can voluntarily move my hand away when I sense there's danger, like in the form of burning my skin off. I can pull my hand away. Then there's autonomic, the autonomic nervous system. This comes from sort of the idea of it's an unconscious part of the nervous system, or I guess more specifically semi-conscious, meaning for the most part, we don't have control over these systems and processes. But there's maybe like a small slice of the pie that we have a little bit of control over. And I'll give some examples in a moment. But basically, the autonomic nervous system is governed by the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. And these two parts of the nervous system are kind of always in a perpetual tug of war to keep the body moving towards connection and safety, and to keep a state of equilibrium in the body. I'm going to pause for 1 second. I'll be right back. Yeah, yeah. Do you think, will you be coming back in, or do you want to text me what you find? Or? Okay, thank you. Yep. All right, so the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system are always in sort of a tug of war with each other, trying to bring the body to equilibrium. Here's an idea of some of the processes that the sympathetic and parasympathetic and sympathetic parts of the autonomic nervous system govern. So the parasympathetic nervous system is always trying to bring the body at rest. The sympathetic nervous system is sort of always preparing the body for threat. So the parasympathetic nervous system constricts pupils while the sympathetic nervous system dilates them. The parasympathetic nervous system causes the heart to beat more slowly, whereas the sympathetic nervous system causes it to beat faster and stronger. And you can feel this every time you breathe. When you breathe in, the sympathetic nervous system is engaged. And if you were to be paying attention to your pulse increases slightly every time you take an inhale. And when you take an exhale, your heart beats slightly more slowly because your parasympathetic nervous system is engaged. And in general, it's for most people, it's easier to engage the sympathetic nervous system than the parasympathetic nervous system. So if you've ever worked with a therapist or done things like done breath work for anxiety, a lot of times you're advised to make your exhales longer than your inhales. And that's because it takes more time to bring the heart rate down than it takes to bring the heart rate up through inhales. So you're trying to bring your heart rate down a little bit. You want to make your exhales longer to sort of engage your parasympathetic and get it to take over a little bit from the sympathetic nervous system. I'm going to move forward. Now, part of the parasympathetic nervous system is what's called the polyvagal nerve. It's often referred to as the vagus nerve, but it's actually a bundle of nerves, meaning more than one, which is where you get this poly from, the polyvagal nerve. The polyvagal nerve, vagus comes from the Latin word for wandering, and it's one of the longest, if not the longest, I forget, nerves in your body. It goes from the base of your brain right here. This is where it innervates or enters your brain, and it goes down alongside your neck. And then, as you see in this diagram on the left, it goes all through the center of the body and outward throughout your torso and down towards your stomach. You can see now on the right, sort of more close up, how this nervous system gets into almost all of the major organs of the body, as well as some of the glands. You may not be able to see this from the Zoom, the font is pretty small, but eye, heart, lungs, liver, pancreas, intestines, sex organs, bladder, all sorts of things. The polyvagal nerve is into everything. And this is why trauma can affect so many different processes in the body, is because of the polyvagal nerve. All right, we only have 10 minutes left. I knew this was gonna be a bit longer than the allotted time, but I think this is it's really important information, and I like to explain things very thoroughly. I think what we're gonna do is we're gonna pause here for the last book. I'm not gonna explain this diagram. Go back. I'll wait to explain this diagram in the next at the beginning of the next session. What we've done so far is gotten an introduction to the nervous system and a little snapshot of where to find the polyvagal nerve in our bodies. And in the next session, we'll start by um, some examples and different stress states that the polyvagal nerve regulates, how different emotional stressors can activate this nerve and dysregulate this nerve. And then, like I said, we'll get into sort of some creative questions about how we can bridge this knowledge with our Orthodox faith and practice. So we do have